having a sample API is a useful tool when learning web development because it gives you something to test your front end against. In this course, we are building a sample API that can be used both locally and via the web. Along the way, we're learning how to build and deploy a minimal API in C#. Now, in this lesson, we're going to utilize the sample API I've already built as a test platform when building both local desktop applications and web applications. This will show you how to utilize the sample API effectively when building demo applications. So let's jump right into Visual Studio, and here we're going to create a new project. So we already have our API deployed. We already have our API a Docker container. Now we're going to just demo the idea that, hey, we're trying out something in WinForms or in Blazor, and we need to test it against some kind of API just so we can have something to play with. So let's start off with the easy one, Blazor web app. And this is going to be a Blazor web app in auto mode. So we're going to call this just Blazor demo, and we're going to call this demo apps. That's fine. And we're going to use the auto, which is both server and WebAssembly. I'm kind of throwing the most difficult thing at it because I want to show off what we can do with this API and how we can test it out. Let's hit create. And now we have our Blazor application, and we want to build out a page that can be used for our for testing APIs and how to talk to an API and all the rest. The first thing I want to do is I want to create a model for this the course information. So let's say Control-Shift-A on the demo client here. We're going to say models, and we're going to say course model.cs. And that creates for us a course model. We can make that a file scope namespace, but filling in all this data is going to be a bit tedious. I mean, if you come over here to our API and go to courses, even if we pre-print this out, we can see we got a lot of stuff going on here, even in one model. I'm going to copy this as just one. Now, I could copy the entire thing. I'm going to copy just one is fine. And I come over here and below everything. I'm not going to do it inside of here, but below here, I'm going to say file. It's actually edit. It's edit paste special, paste JSON as classes. So what this does is it takes the JSON that I have in the clipboard and it turns it into a C# class. So there we go. Now, is it perfect? No. In fact, if we get rid of this root object and come up here, so it's now the course model, we're close, but we really need to fix this up so it looks like it's matching the correct C# way of doing things. Now, here's the fun thing. I'm not going to do it with this, but you can use, and I did this personally when I actually use this as a test for something. You can tell Copilot, hey, you know what? I want you to change the casing on all of these to match the standard Pascal casing for C#. And it will do it for you. And if you ask it right, it will do it correctly. I don't also make all these nullable. So that's the other thing, is to mark your strings as nullable because they are nullable strings. Therefore, you want to make sure you match those up. The other thing to look out for is to check the values here, like course lesson count. That's going to be an integer, but course length count might not be a whole number. Therefore, I'm going to change it to be double. And then price in US dollars, I believe all those, let's just check real quick. I believe we just changed those to be just whole numbers. So yeah, there we go. It looks like they're whole numbers. Therefore, yes, it works just fine to have those as integers in this case. Now, we can also make that a decimal because it is US dollars. That would make sense as well. It's up to you whether you want to do that. I think that for form's sake, I'm going to do that. So this paste isn't perfect, but it's a whole lot faster than trying to recreate all these by hand. So now this all matches. We've got in here all of our properties for one course model. Okay, so now under Pages, and notice I'm in the client here because I want this to be a WebAssembly, actually an auto component. So I don't want to put it in Blazor demo because of the fact that's only for server-side rendered components and Blazor server components. If you need WebAssembly, you need to put a separate project. So this is not a Blazor demo necessarily. So I'm just kind of hitting the highlights here. But I want you to know some of these things. If you want to go deeper, I have a whole course on Blazor. I also have videos on YouTube on Blazor that will give you more details. So courses, and again, we're going to do something that's pretty quick and dirty here. Make sure you use the right extension. Delete that. So courses.razor. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. So that gives us now the component which we can then actually make into a page where we say / courses. That way you can actually call it instead of just use it as a component. Now the goal here will be to create this like mosaic of all the images of all of my courses. And then we'll link to each one of them. We'll make each one clickable. So the first thing to do is to say private list of course model, which we have to control dot here to add the using directive for. Again, if I was making this as a real application, I'd probably put that in the imports, but this is fine for right now. And we'll say this is called courses. Let's make this nullable because it's going to start out null. And then let's also create a private read-only JSON serializer option. And what that's going to do is add a using directive for that. This is going to allow us to set some options and utilize those when we call the JSON object. We're going to say new, and then in here we can say property name case insensitive equals true. Why do we do that? Well, because when we load the JSON by default, let's bring those back. When we load the JSON by default, it's going to load, if you remember, in JSON standard format, which is a camel case for every property. But we made all of our properties Pascal case, which matches C# styling. So therefore, we have a mismatch where lowercase id does not match capital I lowercase d. So it would say, hey, I can't find any of these properties. Instead, what we're going to do is say, hey, the property names are case insensitive, which they're technically not, but what we're saying is in this transition period. So from transitioning from JSON over to C#, treat them as insensitive casing. That way, they can say, oh, I can match these up really easily. And then after that, they are case sensitive in C#. So with this, we have our options. Now we can actually say protected, override, and we'll say on initialized async, which we need to make this a async task. And we can get rid of the base call. And in here, we're going to put a try catch. There we go. And the exception, we're going to say console write line, just because we're doing this quick and easy. So the console says error fetching courses, and we will say ex.message, like so. So that's just a really simple error message. And then we're going to say courses equals new. And that will put a new, it'll actually initialize courses to an empty list, which makes it easier for us to actually do things with that object. And we'll see that in just a minute. But then up here in the try, we'll say courses equals await client which we don't have that client yet. We're going to in just a minute. In fact, let's just bring up here and say inject a HTTP client called client. There we go. And we're going to say client dot get from JSON async. And we're going to ask for a list of course model. And we'll say /courses, and we'll pass in the options. All right, now that's scrolling off the page here. Let's unpin this for now. So we're saying, hey, I want you to get from JSON async, that's the HTTP client, get from JSON async, which means, hey, get the results, convert them, take the JSON, and then convert that into a list of course model all at once. This is using the system.text.json. So it's going to do all that in one step, convert our JSON that is the return value over to a list of course model and put it into courses. But what if it fails? Well, that's why I haven't finished this yet, because I want to say or new. That way, it's not putting a null value in courses. It's going to put a empty initialized list, just like we're doing down here with the error. So this way, at the end of this, no matter what, you're going to have at least initialized courses, even if there's nothing in it. But if there is something in it, well, then courses we populate it. That way, we can do a bit of an if statement up here. So we've got all of our C# code we need to load the information from our client or from our API. So now we can say if and have different states here. Courses is null. So if courses is null, then I want you to say paragraph loading. Okay, that's we could put a loading spinner there if you want. We could put, some other messaging there, or even a placeholder or something. But I think that loading is good enough for now. And we're going to say else if not courses.any. Okay, so it can't find any courses, but the courses has been initialized. It's not null. And again, that comes from either an error here or a caught error here. So either way, in this case, what I want to say is paragraph no courses available. We're not telling you why there's no courses available. We're saying there's no courses available. Else, and then in here, this is where we actually display our courses. We're going to say for each, and we'll say for each var course in courses. And in here, I'm going to create an anchor tag with an href that equals at course.course URL. There we go. Razor sometimes has a problem with you not finishing a tag before doing these things, which is why it yelled at me and didn't give me the IntelliSense. So that's why sometimes I just close it out and then come back to it, like so, and say course.course image. So we're going to put an anchor tag that links to the course URL, and inside that anchor tag, we're going to put the course image, but let's give it some a width of 300. This image would be much too large otherwise. And I will give it alt text. So course.course name. So we're trying really hard to be quick and dirty with this, but at the same time, I want something that actually works, right? I want something that actually is going to be useful and not cut too many corners here. Okay, so we've got our page, but we call this HTTP client. Let's go ahead and set that up. So in program.cs, after our var builder, I want to say builder.services.add scoped, and we're going to say it doesn't matter, X And then this is going to be new HTTP client. And we're going to have a base address equal to new URI. And let's put this on a new line. Let's put it from here. That works. New URI, let's put a semicolon at the end. The URI is going to be let's do our web version first. So HTTPS, the sample API.com. Okay, so we've created a HTTP client that's in our dependency injection so that now we can ask for it here. But we're not quite done yet. There's a bit of a tricky bit here. So let's just run this and see why we're not quite done yet. Let's wait for it to load. All right, so if we go to /courses, we get an unhandled exception. There is no registered service of type HTTP client. Why is that? Because we registered it right here. And yes, you did, or we did, but let's copy this. We registered it in the client, not in the server. And remember, our component is not even specifying what type it is. Wonderful. We're going to specify it as type auto. So let's go ahead and do that. So at render mode, and we're going to say interactive auto. Okay, so it's going to be both a server component and a WebAssembly component, which means that's not going to work. We're not going to be able to do that because of the fact that when it's server, it's going to ask this dependency injection for the HTTP client, and it's not there. So let's add it. I'll paste it in there. So it's the same client, but this way now when it asks for the server component, it will have this. When it asks the WebAssembly component, it will have that one, basically registering it twice. Let's run this again. Wait for it to load. There we go. Courses. There we go. Now, if you're an eagle-eye observer, you may have noticed it kind of loads twice. Okay, so if we say courses, see how it blinks there? It's actually loading and calling the API twice and loading, which some people really freak out about. And yeah, I get that. If you're calling an API twice, that can be frustrating. But the reason why it's doing it is what's called pre-rendering, where it renders it first in the server, sends it down to you, and then it renders it again for the client. So we will address that in just a minute, but I want to show off that, yes, this is a kind of a cool little mosaic that, yes, everything's clickable. So you click on one, it goes right to the location for that particular course. Again, that double render there. So how do you fix a double render? Well, if we're on a page where we're loading an API, most of the time you want the double render because it makes your page load faster, at least to the user's perspective, because they don't necessarily see the flash, but what they're seeing is the page loaded before it's actually technically loaded. But in a case of an API like this, where we're calling something, we don't want to do two calls, we can change this render mode here. So let's take this out and say at new interactive auto render mode. And we're going to say pre-render is false. What this will do is not pre-render, which means the page will be loading for a bit longer visually before the user sees something, which is not bad if you have a fast API like ours. And I'm getting this once in a while. I've got to figure out what this error is. It seemed to only happen in testing once in a while. But I'm not sure why. I think it has to do with the debugger. Sorry about that. Let's clean this and run this again. There we go. Courses, loading, and now it loads. Okay, so it says loading, and then it loads rather than loading the images, then saying loading, then showing the images again. So this can be a better user experience when you're loading API data remotely, and this might be a better option for you, in which case you can turn off that pre-rendering. But that's how to fix that double render. If, again, only if it really is a problem, like you're calling a resource twice, in which case you can change it to pre-renders false. And that's on a per component basis now because of how I set it up, which is what you want. You don't want it to be off for everything. You want that pre-render on wherever possible so the user has a better user experience. Okay, sidetrack there. But now we've got a call out to our API. It's working, it's loading the images. Cool. So now this is kind of like a demo of demoing Blazor and how it works, and try out talking to an API. We could create separate pages for loading individual items and testing how to call an API once, but cache the information and maybe put it into session storage or local storage and pull from there, and so many other things we could do. That's why we have a test API, is to test these various things. Now, let's do this again, but this time on the desktop app. So I'm going to collapse these down. I will close all tabs. That actually opens that back up. Let's add a new project, and I'm going to add a WinForm project. And we'll call this WinForm demo. And yes, .NET 9. If you haven't dealt with WinForms in a while, they're pretty simple. And you might say, oh man, WinForms is so old. Yeah, kind of, but it's also still so relevant. So let's rename this to just courses instead of Form 1. And yes, you want to rename the file and all the classes associated, because in program.cs, we're calling this when we run the application. So new courses instead of new Form 1. Now, in this, what I'm going to do is the first thing I always do is go to properties and come up here to our font size and change this to, let's say 18, which changes the form's size. But that way it's more reasonable. Also, we're going to change down here where it says Form 1. We're going to say DevForge courses, which, by the way, DevForge is the name of my company. It's still all my content, just my content. But we're calling it DevForge instead of just Tim Corey, or I am Tim Corey. Okay, so with that, we now have the form ready to start working. Let's go back to our Solution Explorer. And I'm going to add a models, but not put anything in it. I'm also going to add a services, but then add a HTTP service. We're going to do the shortcut, or the easy way of doing an HTTP service inside of WinForms. I would encourage you to use dependency injection. We're not going to do that here. We're going to make a public static class for our HTTP client. But again, I would encourage you to use dependency injection. It's not that hard to set up. I've done it before in demos, but let me know if you want to see that again. I believe I've also done it in my dependency injection course, which is on, again, iamtimcorey.com. You can see how to do dependency injection with WinForms, WPF, pretty much everything, and how dependency injection works with different, scoped versus transient versus singleton, and so many other things. So in here, I'm going to say public static read-only HTTP client called client, and say equals new and not semicolon. There we go. Base address equals new URI. This price looks familiar now. HTTPS the sample API.com. And we're going to put a semicolon at the end. So now we have this static read-only HTTP client we can call from multiple locations and access directly. It's tied directly to the sample API.com, which means it's really easy to make some calls in here. Now, in our courses, let's go ahead, go to our toolbox, and let's pin this for now. I want a picture box. We're going to do things a little bit different in here than we did for the Blazor demo because I want to show something different. There, I'm going to say properties. Instead of picture box, let's call this course image. And down here at the bottom, we've got size mode for normal. I'm going to set that to, I believe, zoom is what I want. What I want it to do is I want the whole image to fit inside this box instead of being way too massive for this box. Okay, now let's drag a button on here, and we need to be, significant in size because I want to say previous here. And let's make sure that, yep, that shows. So we'll call this just previous. You can call it previous button if you want or something else. I'm going to copy this, and once the spinner goes away, yeah, WinForms can get clunky sometimes, and paste. But we talked a bit about, let's say this is next, about how, yes, WinForms is old in the fact that it's the first UI that C# has, but it's still modernized. So it's still the latest .NET, and which means it's very, very fast. No, it's not cross-platform. It only works on Windows because of the DLLs it uses. It ties into Windows. But this is a really quick way to create applications. Standard WPF, really quick way to create applications. Now, some people don't love XAML. I think once you get no XAML, it's pretty awesome. But yeah, you have options for desktop apps, make them really quickly and easily. So that's it for our form, just an image box and a previous and next. We're not going to do a clickable form or something else. We're going to just do the basic form. Okay, so now we're going to right click here and say View Code, and we'll make this a file scope namespace. That's the first thing I always do. And then we're going to come down here to, above the constructor, we're going to say private list of course model. Don't worry, it's not there yet. And make it nullable and say courses. And where we get that course model from, let's go back up to client. We'll copy it from here. And we'll come down here to model, and we will paste. But then notice that the namespace is wrong. No worries. Control dot to change the namespace to match the folder structure. Hit save on that. And now we can come back over here and say control dot to add a using directive for course model. And I also want to have a private int that is current course equals 0 to start. And then we're also going to bring in, let's come back to our page for courses. And I want this the same options here because we need to do the same thing. So let's bring that in. Notice to add the system text JSON reference. Cool. Or using directive. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a new event for this. So we're going to say on load. Okay, so under properties, we're going to go to events, and we're going to look for the load event. Double click that, and it creates this courses load, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want to see. And by the way, if you delete this, it's going to cause a problem with your form. It's going to crash out the designer. That's because of the fact there's actually two different code behinds. That's why it's a partial class. Get a whole nother video on how to fix that, but just note that's the case. Okay, so I want to say courses. Actually, let's represent a try catch, and we'll say catch ex. And actually, let's not catch, or let's not do anything with it. Yes, let's do something with exception. Let's say message box dot show, and we'll say $ the error calling API, and we'll say ex.message. That's what I do in production, but that's fine for development and testing. Once you go into production, I'd change it to a log that's sent to your logger and log it there instead, so the user never actually sees the internal workings of your application. And here we're going to do the same thing where we say courses equals new. And here we're going to say courses equals await, which changes this to an async task, which is great. And actually, this should be an async void, not an async task, because it's an event handler. Event handlers are one exception to the async task. They instead return async void. So await HTTP service dot client. That's our static HTTP service dot client. We're going to say get from JSON async, and we're asked for a list of course model. Let's unpin this for now. List of course model, and we're going to say / courses and options, like before. Now, that's a little long here, but there's not a whole lot of places to break this. Maybe we could do something like this. That'll work. There we go. So if you haven't noticed already, we're saying / courses because of the fact that the HTTP service has the base URL already set. So you just send whatever the after the base is. So in this case, / courses. So we're asking for the courses, and this is going to be return a nullable list, which I don't love. Therefore, we're going to, again, do the same thing where we say or new. That way, it never returns a null. We always have a value in here, even though this component is nullable. Okay, so that loads up our course, but I want to create a method down here. It's called load course. So private void load course, and we're going to pass in index. And in here, what we're going to do is we're going to say if, and let's just do this, if courses is not null, is null, or index is less than 0, or index is greater than or equal to courses dot count. So what are we doing here? We're going to return. What it's saying is, hey, if you call this load course and you pass in an index that's out of range, meaning it's below 0 or at or above the count, which is 1 above the max index value, or if courses itself is null, and again, this order is important, but if any of those is true, then don't do anything. That way, we can call this method no matter what, and it won't fail. We can call it when the courses is null, or it's an empty list, or it, we pass in a value that's -2. Doesn't matter. It will still work. It's just going to not do anything if you don't give it a valid value. But if you do give it a valid value, we're going to say course image, which is that image box on this form. So course image dot image location equals courses at the index spot of index dot course image. So we're going to put the image of whatever index you chose. If index 0 is the first image, index 1 is the second image, and so on. And then we're going to say current course equals index, meaning we're going to change this value right here to be the new value of wherever we are. We won't change it if you're out of range or if the course is null. Okay, so that's the load course method, which I am going to call this load course method right here. Load course and pass in 0, which should always be a thing anyway, unless the list is empty. But that way we start off at the beginning like you would expect. Now, I also want to create a couple of methods, but actually, you know what? I'm going to shortcut this and not actually create the methods. We could create methods that we then call from the events for this. I'm just going to double click on the button, which creates the event, and just do it directly here, which is to say load course and current course -1, meaning go to the previous one. Again, if we're at 0 already, no problem. It's not going to do anything because it's going to say, hey, index is less than 0. So not a problem. But then down here, we also want to create a next, which do the same thing as this, except instead of -1, it's +1. Let's fire this up. So it says startup project. This should be, I believe, all we need. We're going to find out. All right, so there we go. It's already loaded. It's loaded the first item. I hit next. We go to the next one, and so on. I go previous. It goes back to the beginning. I'm still hitting it. Nothing's happening. I hit next. Goes to the next one. Okay, so we can go through our entire catalog here and load up our images by hitting previous and next. So it's a different way of testing out this API, which is actually not testing the API. We're testing our WinForms skills and skills in development of WinForms. We're just using the API as a data source, so we have something to show off calling a data source. Now, so far we've used the remote version, the version that's on the web. Let's change that. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to bring up here my PowerShell window, and I'm going to say Docker pull the latest version of the API, which it's already up to date, but cool. We've got that. Now I'm going to open up Docker. Let's drag that over. And I have the sample API. I'm going to say run. I'm going to choose a random port is fine. I hit run. And that creates this port 32770. So if I were to open this up, it's going to open up like so, 32770. Let's just copy this URL. And now I am going to come over to my HTTP service and change this to be my local host, 32770. Again, it's HTTP. That's fine for Docker, for local. And I'm going to run this again, and nothing seems to have changed. Now, don't forget, I am calling to the web for all these images. The images are on the web. They're not local, and that's by intent. But we are running off of our Docker container. And I can prove that because if we come over here to Docker and we were to say stop, okay, it stopped. Now we run our WinForm application and there's nothing. It doesn't work. Okay. Error calling API, no connection can be made because the target machine actively refused it. So we've got an error here. If we were to hit start again on that same service, we load this up and, oh, you know what? It changed the IP address because, or the port number, which is 771 now. Let's load this, and there we go. So it has now properly loaded the site again. So that's how you would change to use Docker instead of going out to the remote URL. You can just use that instead. So we've used the local Docker container. We've also used the web version, the sampleapi.com, to call our HTTP service. We've demoed how to work with it when we're doing something in Blazor and trying to test out how Blazor works with various things. We've demoed how to call it from a WinForm project. So this is how you would use this API when you're saying, hey, I want to learn WinForms, or I want to create a WinForms demo and try something out. Well, you have a data source now. You don't have to spin something up or create a data source or a SQL server and all the rest. You can just say, hey, point to that API and use that as a data source. So that's how you would do it. And that's why it's so valuable to have a sample API like this. Now, this API will stay live, so feel free to try it out, test it out, use it, and use it with all of your samples going forward for your applications. All right. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.